how does Plato come to influence Christian thought, Christian theology?
Great, yeah. So from the philosophical perspective, there are kind of a number of big, you might call them big questions in theology that ultimately boil down to big questions in philosophy. From my perspective, the one that matters most, Ray Plato, is this question of the relationship between the body and the soul. And that is really, in some ways, a kind of crucible, boiled down question of the relationship between matter and spirit, or earth and heaven, or whatever, however you want to call it, right? There's sort of, I mean, the word that gets used a lot is dualism, because we're talking about sort of two kinds of thing. And throughout the history of philosophy, there's been a general kind of intuition that these two things exist, that there are, there's stuff, there's tables and chairs and wood and whatever other material facts there are of the world. And then there's also souls and love and desire.
Thoughts and memories and dreams. Yeah.
All of that stuff. Right, exactly. And that don't seem to quite have material being in the same way that tables do. And even there are concepts like table, which, although they have physical instantiations, aren't really themselves physical. So I thought maybe one way to start would be to read. I've got a passage here that I pulled up from the Phaedo, which you'll be familiar with. It's Platonic dialogue. And this is a really important passage for Christians and really for anyone reading Plato. So I'll just briefly read a part of it. This is my own translation, but probably you'll get the same thing in any section. So it's a dialogue, as all of Plato's works are, between Socrates, the great teacher, and Cebes, who is one of his sort of...
And this is your translation?
This is me translating.
Awesome.
Yes. Socrates says, "Now then, essence itself, to which we give the designation of being, isn't it always in the same state, in the same regard, or in different states at different times? So is it the same all the time, or does it change? The equal itself, the beautiful itself, each thing which is in itself, that which is, do they ever take on any kind of change?" And Cebes answers, "They must always remain, Socrates, in the same state." And then Socrates goes on and he says, "And what about the many beautiful things, like humans or horses or articles of clothing or any other things of that kind, like equal things or everything else like that? Do they remain in the same state or entirely opposite to the essences? Are they never the same themselves, nor as one another, nor in a word, in any way with respect to anything?" And Cebes says that second account is right. They are never in the same state. So we're dealing here with this kind of setting up of two different realms, right? And ultimately, this probably traces back to an earlier philosopher called Parmenides. This idea of to enai in Greek, which means being, the sort of existence or being, and to gignesthai, which is to become or to change shape and form. And there's a kind of recognition that there are these stable things like ideas, the equal itself, the beautiful itself, concepts. Ultimately, these are going to get called forms, right? Capital F forms. And then there's these things in the world which seem to have some kind of relationship to those essences, like we see beautiful things, but they're not stable. They don't stay the same. They sort of change all the time. And one of the earlier pre-Socratics we mentioned, talk about Heraclitus, is sort of known for having said everything is like this. Everything is just changing all the time, right? Yeah, everything is in flux. And basically, Plato, with Socrates as a mouthpiece, is trying to say here, nope, there are things which stay the same forever. They are eternally themselves. And the rest of the world the kind of material world that we see and touch and feel around us, that is only kind of participating in or partaking of the real stable stuff. And so then he goes on and he says, Socrates says, "Aren't those things that you can touch and see and perceive by the other senses, whereas the things which remain in the same state cannot be grasped by any other faculty than the logical faculty of the mind, but are invisible and unseen?" And Cebes says, yeah, absolutely. So basically what Socrates is saying here is this world, this changing world of things that are always different, is what we see around us, and we have access to it through the senses. We can touch it and feel it. And that's where we see the human body, for example, is in this world that we can touch and feel. But this sort of stable, eternal, ideal world, we can only see through the mind. We can only use our logic and our reason to grasp it. And that's where the soul lives. And so from passages like this, you get this dualism between the physical world and the human body, which we can see right in front of us, and then the soul, which we have to kind of reason our way to or see with this inner eye of reason in the mind. Okay, so great for Christians in some respects, right? Christians agree that there is a soul, that not everything is just matter, it's just stuff. And many Christians agree that we see the soul not with our tangible sight or with our hands, but that we sort of experience it with our mind or with reason and thought. The question then becomes, what's the relationship between them, right? I mean, Plato uses this word participate, and he says that, well, when you see a beautiful horse, that's this material thing participating in the form of beauty, the abstract form of beauty. And we sort of reason our way by seeing a lot of beautiful things. We can kind of get our way to reasoning towards what is the beautiful.
Descartes thought it was the pineal gland, right?
Yeah. Right. Okay, good. Yeah. So, I mean, certain people have tried to, and that, I mean, these days, right, we can't say that anymore because we basically mapped the brain.
Yeah.
And we think that but right, I mean, for a while there were material ways that we thought we could access this. But if it's the case that we have to kind of reason our way out of matter, to kind of climb up, Plato talks at one point about a ladder out of the material world, and we just get into this kind of ethereal, floaty, jelly world where everything is stable and permanent and beautiful forever, then we have this problem of sort of, well, what is the soul doing in the body? I mean, for Plato, the soul is often sort of, again, Plato talks a lot in the images. The soul is sort of encapsulated or imprisoned in the body. In the Timaeus, he talks about, the gods kind of putting the soul into the body, and then it gets thrown all out of whack by the material world. And this is, again, I mean, Christians too have this sense that the kind of spiritual beings, the beings that love and desire and feel, have been kind of disoriented by the fact that our material world is kind of broken. But we also believe in a God who took on flesh and who has basically redeemed and resurrected the world and will ultimately redeem the whole material world. And so this is one of the big philosophical questions that people raise when Christians come to Plato, right? In the very, very early church, there are a set of people called Gnostics who kind of endorse this separation, this distinction between body and soul. And they endorse it so entirely that God becomes not fully incarnated, and you end up with things like Arianism, which say that Christ is a kind of, you end up, first of all, in Gnosticism with the kind of spirit of Christ and the body of Christ, and they're really not quite the same. And then Arian says, well, Christ is basically a kind of demigod or a messenger from God the Father. And neither of those is quite what Christians are saying. Christians are saying, no, this person was born who was God. And so the body and the soul are capable, at least, of being in this intimate union. And later Platonists kind of run the risk sometimes of rejecting the body and not paying attention to the kind of the here and now, because they're out in these sort of airy philosophical speculations. I mean, one of the visions of Socrates in the Symposium is that he spends his time kind of wandering around just staring in the sky because he's seeing the form of the beautiful. And that's great, but I mean, Christians believe in radical justice here and now, right? And here's Christ going around mixing up mud with spit and putting it on people's eyes. And so how do you square those two things? And that's to set up the question. I think we can talk as we go maybe into the historical stuff about how people have answered that question. But really, I mean, that's what's on the table, is this world of being and the world of the matter and spirit and how they're related to one another.
Okay, so one question that kind of emerges out of that, really curious about this. I see a bit of a contradiction here. If what it means to be human is to be fallen and imperfect and subject to change and decay and sin, and to be, in some sense, naturally, inherently, innately sort of Hobbesian, greedy and licentious and lustful and all of this, how can there be a perfect form or ideal of a human being?
Right. Yeah. Well, one of the things that is true on this point is that Christians don't believe that this is a permanent or an eternal feature of the human person. Christians believe that everything God makes is good, and that any evil is effectively a kind of falling away from or a failure to be what God has made.
Oh, so this is man is made in the image of God. That idea.
Yeah, and this is a hugely important part of the Christian interpretation of of Genesis 1 and 2, the story of the creation of Adam and Eve, the first people, and their eating of the fruit, which basically caused them, as it were, to fall. That is a disobedience. God commands them, don't eat the fruit of this tree. They go off, they're convinced by, in Hebrew, the nachash, which comes to be the serpent. Some sort of being convinces Eve to disobey God. And at that point, the Christians believe that humankind kind of enters into a relationship of disobedience with God. And usually the language that then gets used is the language of return. So it's not so much that, and this is why Plato causes a problem, right? It's not so much that we are inherently just qua material beings with souls, we're inherently kind of out of whack. It's that there's some kind of relationship between the divine soul and the material person that was supposed to be perfect from the beginning and now has kind of gotten out of whack. And again, the spirit is willing, the flesh is weak. We kind of feel this. We sense that, Paul says, I want to do something, but I do the opposite. And we all have this weird relationship with our bodies where we know we aspire to certain things, but we don't always feel able to do them. We might aspire to a workout routine and then not get up in the morning. And so we feel on this deep level this sense of disconnect between the physical and the spiritual. And a really sort of Neoplatonist, that is a hard kind of dualist, might say, well, that's just what it is to have a body, right? Bodies suck. They just drag the soul down into the muck out of the perfect, airy perfection of their reality. But that's not really the Christian attitude. The Christian attitude is no, like this was created good, this thing which is a human being, this kind of mixture of clay, of Adam, literally mud or dust, this mixture of that, and the neshama, the divine breath is the Hebrew word, right? This was kind of meant to originally be one thing in harmony. And that harmony was broken when we used our free will to kind of go off the beaten path. But that's basically what Christ is supposed to reconcile, is by becoming the kind of perfect instantiation of God in flesh. He shows us the way to be what it is that we were always supposed to be. So that's a long-winded way of saying, for Christians, it wasn't always supposed to be like this.
So another question then that I have is that how can human beings have access to the perfect, Platonic ideal? How if I am a fallen creature with a body, how do I have access to what I'm supposed to be, right? If the body's an imperfect copy of the perfect Platonic ideal, how do I access what I'm supposed to know so that I can bring myself in closer to the ideal?
Yeah. So I'll give you the Platonist answer, and then I'll give you the Christian Platonist answer, and we'll go from there. The Platonist answer is sort of what I articulated from the Symposium. There's a famous speech by the priestess Diotima in that dialogue, and that's where the image of the ladder comes up. And basically, what is said there is, look, we live in this changing, broken, weird world, but even this world kind of participates in the eternal world. And we know this because we see the beautiful in front of us. We see beautiful people and beautiful things and beautiful clothing and all this stuff. But it's all kind of mixed up and concatenated, and we don't really have a true sense of what the beautiful is until we look at all of this stuff using our senses. We experience all these beautiful things, and then we perform a kind of process of abstraction. We say, what is it that's common to all of this stuff? How is this beautiful political system, this good political system, the same as this beautiful person? And how is that the same as, what does it share with this beautiful horse? And what does it mean to be good or beautiful? And ultimately, and this is something that Plato begins very early on in his career in the Euthyphro. How do we get to like the essence of the thing itself? And that is the process of reasoning and climbing that sort of lets us ultimately just gaze with the eye of the mind upon the beautiful. That's a very kind of, you might call it a humanist approach, although ultimately behind it, it's got a kind of idea. And God kind of put the logos, the spark of reason, into us from the beginning. But we in that model are kind of sufficient to climb our way out. For someone like Augustine, who is an early church father who basically endorses this view of a kind of material world and a spiritual world, broadly speaking, there still has to be some kind of divine intervention to enable us to do this kind of intellectual and when I say intellectual, it sounds very thinky, but it's, you might also say spiritual, this kind of use of our the use of our mind, our non-sensory perception to see the divine. This is the doctrine of illumination in Augustine, that effectively we have help, that God has basically instilled in us some sense which is able still to work its way out of this broken world, to sort of see or intuit or have a half sense of where we're going. And that is, and for many people, that's the process of discernment. And in fact, this goes all the way back to the Gospels, in the Gospel of John, right? That it said that Christ is the true light which lightens everyone that comes into the world. And this idea that, for everybody, not even just for Christians, for everybody, there is this kind of divine illumination that kind of guides us on the way. So it's not so much that we're blind as that we're have really, really, really bad vision,
So this reminds me of two things that I want you to touch on. The first thing that it calls to mind is Plato's cave allegory. And then the second, the light, obviously, and being a prisoner in a cave and not seeing the world the way that it really is, and escaping from that illusory sort of, idealistic, subjective picture of the world, and emerging into the light of the way things really are. But also it calls to mind the idea of the logos, which you touched on, right? And so if I have this right, the logos, from what I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, is the word of God. It's the divine reason. It's the order. It's the truth that God speaks, and this brings order into chaos. Gives the cosmos form, right? Structure, meaning, and then Christians. And here's where I might be off. Christians believe that Christ is the Word of God made flesh, right? Who then reveals God's plan of salvation to the world, to man. And then there's a sense in which man is made in God's image and is to some degree a manifestation of the Logos. Correct me where I've gone off the rails.
Okay. Wow. Well, you got it. Basically, I would mostly endorse most of what you said. Let's start with your first question, and we'll move on from there. The Allegory of the Cave is a famous, but rightly famous, section of Plato's Republic, in which he basically gives an image for this kind of discernment that I was talking about. Basically, the image is that we, poor benighted people, are trapped, chained in a cave. Most of us don't even know we're there. We think we're out in the real world of light.
Is the cave is the cave my body, my imperfect bag of flesh in which my spirit is housed? Is it my imperfect, naive subjectivity that does not view, as Kant would say, things in themselves, or as Buddhists would say, things from their own side?
Yeah.
Is it
both
like
of those are Both of those are apt comparisons. I mean, I think that the cave. So one question that a reader of Plato might have is whether it's true that we have to give up our bodies to get out of the cave. Later readers of Plato will basically suggest that, but it's not clear that that's what Plato thinks. So the cave is either our body itself, out of which we must descend sort of intellectually, or it's just our current world and the state of our world as it is now. But certainly outside is the sun, which is effectively Kant's noumenal world, as you were saying, or it's things from their own side, the truth of the way things are. And the sun is projecting light into the cave just a little bit. And then there are people, perhaps gods, with shadow puppets, basically puppets that against which the light hits. And what we see in the world are those shadows. So just kind of echoes of an echo, these little forms, I mean, not Platonic forms, but just images of what is really true.
Representation, yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Representation.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. And one of the remarkable things about the cave is that Plato suggests that through some totally unknown mechanism, the only way for us to get out is for somebody to go up into the light and see the light. And eventually, as his eyes adjust, he'll see what's really true. And then if he were to come back down, Plato says, and tell the story or tell what's there and explain that this is a cave and the truth is out there, he would be torn limb from limb.
They would hate him. They would get mad at him. So this is the story of Christ.
Right. I mean, this is why one of the reasons why Plato is often characterized not just as an important philosopher, but as the divine Plato, or even a kind of secular prophet. I mean, Dante famously in the Divine Comedy, there's a vision of going down into hell. He's a kind of Christian who believes that everybody who hasn't heard of Christ is in hell. But he puts Plato kind of in this like waiting room outside of hell. It's not quite, like a lot of the and Virgil is his guide through hell. So this, I mean, this sense that the great Greek philosophers kind of had their noses pressed up against the glass of what would eventually be revealed in Christ is very palpable in that cave allegory.
Well, that's a great image for us.
Right, it's perfect. Yeah, it really works beautifully. We should then talk about the Logos, which is actually not unrelated. So Logos, let's start here. Logos is a Greek word. It is untranslatable. It means many different things at different times in English. Some of the best ways to translate it are speech, reason. You might even say meaning, but other people also say word, right? So, or language. And the question of how you translate it is related to the question of what you think it is. But ultimately, it has something to do with this kind of rational structure, which in Plato, especially in the Timaeus, undergirds the whole universe. This is related to another philosopher we haven't talked about, Pythagoras, right? This notion that there's a kind of rationally comprehensible structure at the basis of the whole universe. Math, right? Exactly. Logos. Another word that logos is used to mean is ratio. So the relationship between two numbers. And so from Plato onwards, there's this question or this sense, and even before Plato, is the whole universe arranged according to a logos? Is there a thread of reason and logic and a structure running through? And a number of people answer with an emphatic yes. Among them, the Stoics, who I'm sure we'll encounter in a different episode. But the Stoics agree, by and large, with Plato that the whole world is sort of logically organized or permeated by a logos and a reason. The Stoics, unlike Plato, are corporealists, which is kind of a fancy way of saying they're almost materialists. Mm-hmm. They basically don't believe that there is any, world that doesn't have to do with bodies. And so their sort of logos is a little bit different than Plato's. But throughout, you have this idea that the logos is what threads through the entire universe. And because it's such a linguistic word, what that means is that God is kind of communicating through his creation, or, the fact of God's creation has embedded or encoded into it the nature of God or the goodness of God. The place that this becomes important for Christianity is in the first chapter of the Gospel according to John. I mean, not the only place, but John is very interested both in Stoic philosophy, but in kind of the way that this logos is related to Christ. And basically the way it seems to work is that the logos, understood as the kind of universal structure of the world as encountered in Plato's Timaeus, is the second person of the Trinity, is the Christ, and is part of God. It's part of God to be sort of expressing himself in creation in this way. But Jesus, the dude to whom I referred, is the kind of encoding of that logos into a human life. So Christ is then a kind of language that God uses to tell us everything about himself. So even though the whole universe has this logos sort of thread through it, we only live in this little tiny space and time, right? And so what God does in Christ is in some ways to sort of take that whole reason and structure and shrink it on down into a person that we can see and talk to and read about and know. And that's kind of how it becomes the case that Christ is the illumination, or the one that sort of communicates to us who God is. And because God is fundamentally in some ways like us. That is, he made us in his image and can be expressed in human terms. That works, right? Jesus basically communicates to us. One of the metaphors that I've used is, I was once flying in a plane over a cornfield, and the cornfield had a giant R, the letter R, stamped into it. So some of the stalks of corn had been flattened down, and they were in this shape of an R. And it's sort of like, when you're flying over, you can see that that's true. But if you're just in the cornfield, right, it just sort of looks like, well, some stalks are down, some stalks are up. It's kind of irrational in any sense. Jesus is what it's like to fly up in the plane and see the R inscribed, so that then when you go out back into the world and you say, oh, it doesn't look rational to me, but actually I know it's just a small part of this massive personality that's being expressed in the world. And that's why when I said to you at the beginning that, I've always encountered this personality in the world, that's what I believe I was encountering, was like Jesus writ large, and Jesus in the Gospels is sort of Jesus up close and personal.
So when human beings create civilization, when we bring our values, our religions, our ideas to bear on humanity, and we live in the right way, and we have a civilization that is just to some degree, how is it the case that we've brought, that we have harnessed the Logos when God has already spoken the Logos into being, if that's an intelligible question at all?
Absolutely it is, yeah. And the person that you would really want to turn to for this is, again, not someone he's not unrelated to Plato, but is closer to Aristotle, and that's Thomas Aquinas, the great Christian philosopher who writes the Summa Theologica in the 1200s. Aquinas has this whole theory of natural law, divine law, and then sort of human law, the law of the world. And that's where you start to ask, well, what's the relationship between human societies, human actions, human persons, and this great transcendent order, cosmic order that we see manifested in Christ? Great, here he is, there in front of us. How should we now live? And basically, the way that this works, at least for me, and I think for other Christians as well, is that what happens when you encounter the Logos or sort of learn from the Logos in itself is that you experience not only a personhood, but a pattern or a spirit, a kind of way of being. And just like a tree, Jesus uses the language of the kingdom of heaven like a mustard seed, which grows out into a tree, right? That one set of relationships, that one trinity, can have implications that branch out in a million different ways. And one of the reasons why Christ is supposed to basically usher the Gentiles into the Jewish tradition is that he makes what was originally kind of locked into a culturally contingent individual nation and people, makes it a kind of typology or a blueprint that can be then just expanded outward into a million different societies and communities. And so even though we have this kind of eternal word that is forever speaking, we also have these, we still live in the world of taugegnesti, the world of changing and individual contingencies. And so in this particular moment, how is it that what the Logos has communicated to us plays out in your life and my life? What do we do in response? And again, one of the things I believe is that I actually can't answer that question for you. I can answer it haltingly in prayer for myself and then in community with others. But what I can't tell you is a set of rules that's always going to work for acting that out in every place and time.
So that is going to have a huge importance on natural rights theory. The idea that our rights, because that's one of the questions when we're talking about this in school. Yeah. One of the questions I get is how in the world is it possible that our rights aren't given to us by government? How does that even make sense? Kids will ask, isn't it the government that protects our rights? We don't get to use them unless they're given to us by government, right? And then you have to say, no, those rights exist in a state of nature, and governments are formed to honor those rights and essentially to help you have your right to life, liberty, and property. And then you can talk about Locke and mixing your labor with the land and all of this stuff. So, but this actually extends all the way back into early Christian thought, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And I think that, most of the political theories to which you just alluded are steeped in the kind of Christian attitude towards what the human person is. There actually, in my own not so humble opinion, like there aren't actually there aren't any particularly good ways of grounding universal rights, except in some sort of theory of divine investment in the human person.
I was going to say, it's hard to conceive of those rights without that foundation.
Exactly. And that brings its own inconveniences with it, right? I mean, it means, for example, that if every human life, regardless of kind of utilitarian consequences of that life, if every human life is worthwhile and valuable qua creation of a God who invests his image into it, well, then we have to ask serious questions about the taking of human life, for example, in the womb, and obviously that is a political question with really kind of thorny and emotional, raises really thorny and emotional difficulties. But I think that it's sort of our only route forward. I mean, we can acknowledge, right, that there are extreme cases in which abortion presents really sort of difficult questions. But in order to preserve the sanctity of human life, full stop, and the implication in human life of the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, for example, I think the only way forward we have is to say, from conception, that's what you are, regardless of whether you are stunted in your growth or, deeply flawed from the eyes of the world, right? I mean, this is kind of the one way to ground universal rights, essentially.
Yeah, and so one of the things that I don't like is when people use those marginal cases to argue the rule, right? When they actually use those marginal cases to say that odd, rare occurrence is why we should have this entire regime, this program of ending life. So that said, yeah, it's difficult without using religious language to talk about, because you can be the deists, you can be the founding fathers, and you can say, well, of course, like Locke would say, in a state of nature, you have a right to your own existence, you have a right to your own life, and then because you have a right to your life, you need to be able to have certain other natural negative rights, like your right to work, a right to your own labor, and a right to your own property, so that you can work and keep the fruits of your labor and all of this, and you have a right to not have your liberties infringed upon because you have a right to your life and all of this. But it's like, where is the first mover? Where is the first mover?
Yeah.
Why, if you're John Locke and you're using an entirely secular argument, why then do you have a right to life?
Right.
Without the tradition that you're describing, how do you even have a right to life? In a state of nature, it seems to me that you don't actually have a right to life. Where does that come from? Help me.
Yeah. Oh, gosh, I wish I could. I mean, without a theological, we should be clear, right, that we've left Christian territory here. We've left uniquely Christian territory, and we're talking purely about theism, right? I mean, you don't need to believe what I believe about the person of Jesus Christ to believe that there is a creator God who invests infinite value in the humans that he creates. Without that, though, it is very difficult to find a grounding for human value that is a priori. That is to say, you can argue for the value of human people who produce things, for example, or who are capable eventually of producing things. But even those values imply that those things would have value as having been produced. And why? Because they benefit humans, which must mean that, again, somewhere at the back of that is just a naked assertion that human life and human flourishing is of worth. Once you say that, you are positing that as just a kind of one of the premises, one of the facts of the universe. The problem with asserting that anything is of worth per se is that it immediately raises the question of worth to whom, right? Worth is something which only really takes shape or exists in relationship to a consciousness. And so if you've said that human beings are just of worth full stop, then you've suggested that in that full stop place, in that place without any pre-existing conditions or other human beings, if there were only one person, that person would be of worth. Well, you have to ask, to whom, right? And so you really ultimately do need a divine consciousness, some kind of perceiving being to say, human beings, that's it. They matter. They have worth. And again, the implications of that are up for debate. We can talk about, whether that means that you have a right to a gun or not. And I happen to think that it does, but that's many, many steps down the line. Nevertheless, the concept, you're right, of natural rights is, I can't offer you a secular grounding for it because I don't believe that one exists.
Yeah,